Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wondered why a violin sounds like a violin and a flute sounds like a flute, even if they're playing the same note? It all comes down to how the sound is made and what it vibrates. Today, we're diving into some fascinating research about how our brains process these different sound ingredients and what happens when they're mixed in unusual ways. Imagine a musical instrument. It is basically made of two key parts. First, you have the excitation, that is the action that starts the sound. Think about rubbing a bow across a string, blowing into a pipe, or hitting something with a stick. Then you have the resonator, that is the part that vibrates and amplifies the sound, like the string itself, the air inside a flute. Or a metal plate, most instruments use a typical combination. For example, you bow a string, you blow an air column, and you strike a plate. But what happens when you mess with these combinations? What if you try to bow air or blow a string? It sounds weird, right? Well, scientists created these atypical sound combinations using computer simulations to see how our brains interpret them. These researchers used a special computer program called Modalys. Think of it like a super advanced synthesizer that can build sounds from the ground up based on how real instruments work. They created 9 different combinations, 3 types of excitations, bowing, blowing, and striking, each paired with 3 types of resonators, a string, an air column, and a plate. So that is bowing a string, bowing an air column, bowing a plate, and so on for all the combinations. 4 of these were typical, like a bowed string. The other 5 were atypical, like bowing an air column. They made many versions of each sound, tweaking tiny details to capture different timbres or sound qualities. From all these sounds, they selected 3 really distinct examples for each of the 9 combinations, giving them a total of 27 sounds to test. Then they brought in human listeners. They split them into 2 groups, musicians and non-musicians. This was important because musicians spend a lot of time interacting with instruments and might have a different understanding of how sounds are produced. They ran 2 main experiments. In the first experiment, they played a sound and asked people to rate how much it sounded like bowing, blowing, or striking. In the second experiment, they played the same sounds and asked people to rate how much they sounded like a string, an air column, or a plate. The idea was to see if people could correctly identify the excitation and resonator parts of the sounds, especially the weird made up ones. Let's talk about what they found. When it came to the excitations, or how the sound was made, people were pretty good at telling the difference between sounds that were struck and sounds that were sustained, like bowed or blown sounds. This makes sense because struck sounds are like a quick hit, while bowed and blown sounds go on for a while. The most interesting results came from the atypical sound combinations. For example, when they played the sound of a bowed air column, people didn't strongly agree on whether it was bowed or not. Look at this graph for bowing ratings. You see that the bowed string got very high bowing scores, which is expected, but for the bowed air column, the bowing score was lower, and it didn't really stand out as being clearly bowed. It seems that when the combination of excitation and resonator was unusual, people's brains got a bit confused. They tended to latch onto what they knew best. For instance, if a sound had the characteristics of blowing, but it was presented as a bowed air column, people might still hear the air column part and think, well, air columns are usually blown, not bowed, pulling their rating towards blowing. The same kind of confusion happened when they looked at the resonators or the vibrating part. Again, for typical sounds like a blown air column, people were very confident they were hearing an air column. But for the unusual sounds, things got mixed up. For example, in figure 3b, you see that the blown air column received high air column ratings. But look at the bowed air column. While it got some bowing ratings in experiment 1, here in experiment 2, it surprisingly received good air column ratings too. This suggests that even though the excitation was bowed, listeners might have leaned towards recognizing the air column because they know air columns are typically blown. So even with the wrong excitation, the familiar resonator could still be identified. On the flip side, sometimes the excitation strongly influenced the perception of the resonator. For instance, a sound that was blown but was meant to be a blown string was sometimes perceived as more like an air column. This hints that our brains have strong mental models for how these things usually work, formed by years of listening and experience. The study found that listeners were generally good at recognizing typical instrument sounds. This is because we've all heard them countless times, and our brains have built strong mental maps, or models, for how a bowed string should sound, or how a blown air column should sound. This includes not just hearing the sound, but also knowing what is physically possible. We know you can't really bow air effectively. The really interesting part is what happens with the atypical combinations. Instead of forming new mental models for these weird sounds, listeners seem to try and fit them into their existing models of typical instruments. If a sound had some characteristics of bowing but was an air column, people might nudge their perception towards bowing because strings are typically bowed. Or, if it was a blown plate, they might lean towards an air column because blowing is so strongly associated with air columns. This figure nicely summarizes everything. See how the black bars representing the correct ratings for typical combinations like Bosc and black are nice and high. But for the atypical ones like Boake or BLPL, the ratings are spread out and lower for the correct category and higher for a different, more familiar category. For example, Boake got some blowing ratings and some air column ratings, not just a clear bowing rating. It seems like when something is unfamiliar, we rely heavily on what we already know. One of the big takeaways is that it seems easier for us to identify the action or excitation, whether it was struck, bowed, or blown than it is to identify the material or resonant structure. This is often true for how we process sounds in general. We notice the way something is hit or blown very quickly. Identifying the exact material or shape of what is vibrating might take a bit longer. And even then, it can be tricked by the excitation. Also, a bit surprisingly, the researchers found that having musical training didn't make a huge difference in correctly identifying these combinations, even the atypical ones. This suggests that our basic mental models for how instruments work are pretty well formed by everyday listening, not just by formal musical study. So, what does this all mean for us? It tells us that our perception of sound is deeply tied to our expectations based on experience and physical possibility. When faced with something new, our brains don't create entirely new categories from scratch. Instead, they try to force the new sound into the closest existing box. This can lead to some funny misinterpretations. But it is a sign that our brains are incredibly efficient at making sense of the world using the information they already have. It shows us how powerful our existing knowledge and familiarity are in shaping what we hear. The researchers acknowledge that their computer simulations, while advanced, are still simplifications of reality. They also noted that they didn't explore every possible parameter for every sound, so there is always more to discover. Future studies could look at whether people can learn to identify these atypical sounds better over time, or how different cultures might perceive these combinations based on their own musical traditions. Overall, this research is a fantastic illustration of how our brains interpret the complex world of sound. It's a reminder that what we hear is not just a direct recording of reality, but a construction shaped by our experiences, expectations, and even our knowledge of what physics allows. Thanks for joining me on RUBIN'S Mind Lab. If you found this interesting, give this video a thumbs up. Leave a comment with your thoughts and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next dive into the amazing world of psychology and science. See you next time.